She fired me like she was pitching to a podcast-tight script, forced smile, one eye on the HR rep in the corner. "Thank you for your years of service," she said, like she was announcing a giveaway. "But we're streamlining legacy roles to better align with the future of Axionet." Kendra Vale always did love buzzwords and cameras. There wasn't one in the room, but she delivered every word like there was a phantom spotlight framing her freshly bleached grin and designer blazer. I didn't speak, just watched the way she crossed one leg over the other like she'd practiced the gesture in front of a ring light. She looked too proud of herself for a decision she didn't even understand. "My name is Owen Merrick, 12 years at Axionet Corp, lead systems architect since year 3. I built the infrastructure that held the place together before the cloud transitions, before the compliance protocols had names. Back when we still patched servers by flashlight in the supply closet. To Kendra, I was just legacy. She called that the problem. She'd been promoted to VP of Innovation 2 months after marrying the CEO's daughter. Before that, she'd managed a lifestyle app that failed during its Series B round because she forgot to lock down the back end. I'm not guessing I read the repo notes myself. But now with a new title and an open floor plan, she was on a mission to modernize the tech stack. Translation cut, cost cut heads, and make it look like leadership. So, when the quick sync invite hit my calendar, 4:45 p.m. No agenda, no context, I already knew. I've seen it happen to smarter people than me, and I just didn't expect her to enjoy it so much. "I want you to know this isn't about performance," she said. Which is HR code for, this is 100% about politics. It's about alignment. I almost laughed. Alignment. I'd aligned our invoice pipeline after the finance tool migration she greenlit without testing. I'd aligned the cross-region failovers by hand when her consultants missed a critical time zone parameter. I'd aligned myself into burnout so many times I stopped remembering weekends. But sure, let's call this a clean slate. She slid a branded folder across the table, like she was doing me a favor. There's a generous exit package, she added, voice, all silken posture. 3 months plus, outplacement. I flipped it open, scanned for the clause I'd buried years ago. The one that said, my automation scripts were my IP. It was still there, still binding. She didn't know. She never asked what kept the queues flowing or the vendor logs clean. She never asked who rerouted the billing APIs after her consultants crashed staging. She never asked who, after all these years, was still holding the place together. And that silence was about to cost her more than she realized. Before I go any deeper, do me one favor. Comment below where you're listening from, hit like, and subscribe the Chanel. You might know someone who's been here before, or someone who's about to be. Because what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, it was quiet, and it changed everything. They thought firing me was the last move, but I'd already taken my hands off the wheel. They just didn't know what I'd been steering all this time. Kendra Vale arrived like a pop-up ad in human form, flashy, unskippable, and completely uninterested in how the back end actually worked. The first time I met her, she was carrying a neon pink planner and talking about scrubbing legacy mindsets before she'd even seen a line of our code base. She'd just married the CEO's daughter, apparently after meeting at some Aspen Tech retreat involving sound baths and blockchain manifestos. 2 weeks later, she was installed as VP of Product Strategy at Axionet. That was the title anyway. What she actually did was host Monday morning stand-ups where she'd butcher acronyms, point at whiteboard diagrams like they were inspirational quotes, and say things like, "Let's be the Uber of scalable solutions." She called me the script guy once. I've written infrastructure for global platforms and personally rewired our provisioning system after a failed vendor migration nearly cost us 3 major clients. But I nodded, smiled, and stayed quiet. Because people like Kendra don't fire you for being wrong. They fire you for making them look wrong. She never asked how anything worked, not once. And when things failed, because of course they did, she'd slap a Canva deck over it, call it growth turbulence, and pitch another initiative with words like synergy and digital elasticity. I remember one meeting where she presented a new rollout plan. The centerpiece was a database overhaul using a tool that didn't even support multi-tenant environments. I flagged it, politely. In private, her response, "Owen, maybe it's time we think less like engineers and more like disruptors." Right. Meanwhile, my patching scripts were the only reason our logistics dashboard still displayed real-time inventory. I'd hard-coded a fallback routine to handle when the new system couldn't process regional timestamps, a flaw she once dismissed as not user-facing. What stung wasn't her arrogance. It was how quickly everyone adjusted to it. The board started quoting her. Clients began parroting her slide deck slogans. Interns mimicked her tone. And me, I became background. Once she removed my name from the project summary, before presenting it to the executive team, called it a formatting error, I didn't push back, but something in me started to shift. I'd been at Axionet 12 years. I built half the systems she now called clunky. I documented every exception case, trained the new hires, filled in when procurement forgot to renew licenses, patched security vulnerabilities before legal even saw the alerts. But none of that fit the story she was telling. She needed to look like the visionary, and I was the furniture. There was one moment I still replay. A Thursday. She was giving a tour to a vendor team from Munich. I happened to be walking by my server room, when I heard her laugh and say, "Oh, that we're sunsetting all of it soon. The guy who built it still thinks Bash is cutting edge." They chuckled. She knew I was within earshot. I just kept walking. But that night, I started moving certain admin keys into isolated access logs. No changes, no tampering, just preparation. Because you can only be invisible for so long before people forget you were ever the one holding the system together. And one day they'll notice. When it stops. Because we're just getting to the part where she made her biggest mistake yet. And this time I didn't fix it. It was the Thursday rollout call. The one that started with a smile and ended with a silence so loud I still hear it. Kendra had just come back from some fintech conference in Miami full of buzzwords and branded notebooks. She walked into the strategy meeting, already talking, waving around a new cost-neutral optimization package she planned to implement by Q2. What it really was, if you read the footnotes, was a mass disablement of 2 legacy monitoring clusters. Mine. "We're paying for redundancy that no one even checks anymore," she said, flipping to a slide that showed red and green blocks like they meant something. They weren't redundant. They were the only thing keeping our telemetry live when international nodes went dark. Anyone who'd stayed past 7 p.m. in the last 6 years knew that. But those people weren't in the room anymore. I opened my mouth twice, closed it both times. She'd brought Marcus from finance into the meeting. He backed her up talking about quarterly burn rate and server deprecation. And the thing is, they made it sound reasonable. Slick, logical, modern. But the moment that really cracked me, was when she looked straight at me and said, "Owen, I know these systems are kind of your baby, but it's time we evolve past duct tape." And everyone in the room nodded. I'd written that so-called duct tape the night our vendor's API went sideways mid-holiday shipment cycle. My fallback kept 200 orders from misrouting. No press release, no bonus, just a quiet Slack message from the CTO at the time. "Thanks for saving our ass." Now no one even remembered. I stayed quiet, again. That night the disablement script was pushed live. And the next morning, we missed 3 alert triggers. Small ones, latency spikes in Sao Paulo, cache sync failures in Toronto. But the kind of signals that show up weeks later, as revenue loss. Kendra didn't acknowledge it. She called the rollout a success. 0 user disruption, she said in the team-wide email. Just a smiley face and a thumbs-up emoji in the Slack thread below it. But in my gut, I felt it. That was the first real fracture. And it wasn't just tech. 2 days later, I overheard her on a client check-in. She assured them we were fully cloud-native with 0 legacy dependencies. That wasn't just aspirational, it was false. I flagged the recording to legal, quietly, privately. They told me to trust the leadership direction and avoid adversarial language. That's when I knew. This wasn't about fixing things anymore. This was about staying out of the way while the narrative was being rewritten without me in it. And I kept telling myself it wasn't worth it. The fight, the pushback, the risk. But later that week, I found myself sitting in the empty server room, staring at the last handwritten diagram I'd ever pinned to the corkboard, still there after all these years, fading ink, curled corners. But it worked. It always had. I used to think silence was a virtue. My father did too. He died with secrets that should have saved people. I remember tracing the edge of that old diagram with one finger just to prove it still existed. Because after that meeting, I wasn't sure I did. We lost 2 vendor contracts the following month, both citing unresolved delivery inconsistencies. Kendra blamed the onboarding team, but I knew, and I knew what would come next. What none of them saw was already failing in the background. And the worst part, I could have stopped it. I just didn't. 3 weeks after the rollback, a shipment to Jakarta vanished. Not delayed, not rerouted. Gone. The tracking logs were blank from node 47E outward, and the failsafe that should have flagged the gap. It was part of the cluster Kendra had sunset. She spun it fast. Localized vendor-side disruption, she said on the emergency call with operations. I watched her click through an old slide deck like it held answers. She used phrases like strategic latency and geo-routing volatility, none of which meant anything to the people whose product was now sitting in a black hole somewhere off the Java Sea. I could have corrected her. I didn't. Instead, I watched Marcus from finance recalibrate the revenue forecast mid-call. He didn't even blink, just adjusted the sell range and moved on. That was the moment I realized this company didn't run on truth. It ran on story. And hers was the only one being told. We'd built the Jakarta node during a blackout year when most teams were under hiring freeze. I pulled 11-hour days configuring load balancing routes on hardware 3 years out of support. We did it because we had to. Because the client needed it and no one else would fight for it. Now that whole region was running on Kendra's slide decks and cost neutrality. And this was just the start. A week later, an internal audit quietly flagged inconsistencies in our real-time uptime logs. The numbers weren't matching the vendor reports. Normally, this would trigger a compliance review. Kendra buried it. I know because I saw the thread. She added a deprioritized for Q4 tag and forwarded it to Marcus with a winking emoji. I saved a screenshot. Didn't say anything. But I started organizing access logs, time-stamped backups, version control deltas, Slack message headers, nothing altered, nothing tampered. Just preserved. Because it was all happening now. The slow unraveling. And no one wanted to look at it. Once Kendra pulled me into a quick 1-1 and said, "Owen, I know we haven't always aligned, but I really value your stability." Stability. Like I was a structural beam, not a person. Like the building was already leaning, but she still needed something to pin her whiteboard to. I nodded. I thought about the first job I ever had in tech, back when I still believed good infrastructure was invisible. That if no one noticed your work, it meant you were doing it right. That belief cost me more than time. It made me complicit in my own erasure. I spent 2 nights rechecking a script I hadn't touched in 5 years. One of the old failovers I wrote back when we still cared about resilience. It still worked. But I didn't deploy it. Instead, I let the alerts pile up. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, we missed a customer gateway handshake for a client in Luxembourg. No one caught it. Not at first. The only reason it surfaced was because the client's legal team submitted a complaint citing breach of SLA. That triggered a board review. That's when Kendra panicked. She ordered a code freeze. She called it a strategic hold for realignment. But I knew it was fear. I watched her pace the floor of the glass-walled conference room, phone pressed to her ear, the same way I'd seen engineers do during server fires, only this time she wasn't fixing anything. She was spinning. The thing about panic is, it distorts time. Everyone starts reacting to echoes instead of signals. And when that happens, people like me become very, very quiet, because noise is cover. I didn't sabotage anything. I just didn't stop what I'd already seen coming. And when the client demanded a formal review of our architecture logs, that's when I knew. The fallout had begun. And the best part, no one was looking in my direction. Not yet. The thing about collapse is it rarely starts with fire. It starts with silence. I stopped correcting Kendra's decks. I stopped flagging outdated flowcharts in her client briefings. I stopped being the safety net she never acknowledged. And I started archiving. Not out of malice. Not at first. The night the Luxembourg complaint reached our legal inbox, I logged into the redundancy shell we'd mothballed years ago. Not to fix anything, but to track who accessed what and when. That shell wasn't just legacy code. It had something newer systems didn't: an immutable access log. I'd written it back in 2016 when we were bracing for a merger that never happened. Every login, download, and handoff since then was time-stamped and mirrored, quiet, infallible, invisible. No one remembered it was still running. I did. I pulled 6 months of logs, indexed them by user tag, filtered out the noise. Kendra's digital signature showed up in places it shouldn't have been. Data previews from finance she never requested. PDF exports of compliance protocols she claimed she never saw. I exported the audit trail and saved it in a private drive tied to my external advisory retainer, fully within my scope. fully logged. 2 days later, I attended a vendor sync where Kendra told the external PM we've deprecated Owen's architecture entirely. It was legacy junk. I nodded politely. That legacy junk was still running 40% of our East Asia operations. But I didn't say a word. Instead, I added the transcript to a folder titled Statement Discrepancies. It joined 5 other meeting recordings, all with metadata, all date-stamped. It's strange how calm I felt, like preparing for a storm you've seen coming for months. I archived the Slack threads from the Jakarta root cause analysis. In one, she told DevOps to delete traces of the config drift to avoid panic optics. She left a smiley face after the message. I included that too. I also downloaded the file history on the new pipeline doc. She'd presented it as her own architecture. It had my name in the metadata, and 3 version revisions from a year ago, authored by me. I copied them to cold storage, not to leak, not to threaten, just to protect what was mine. Because it wasn't just the company breaking, it was my own restraint. There was a moment late one night when I opened an old ethics document I'd helped draft. It said, "Truth without documentation is noise." Back then I believed that. Now I understood the second half. And noise doesn't survive, spin. Before I go deeper, please take a second to like and subscribe, especially if any of this reminds you of a time you stayed silent a little too long. It means more than you think. Anyway, I'd always thought my revenge, if it ever came, would be explosive. But the most dangerous revenge is compliance. Because compliance doesn't shout. It doesn't burn the place down. It just watches, records, waits. By the end of the month, I had a folder of innocuous files that meant nothing unless you knew what to look for. Kendra didn't. But her husband, he would. Because as CEO, he'd signed off on our latest governance protocol update. And the next time he looked at that policy, he'd find my name in the changelog. Not loud, just undeniable. And by then, it would be far too late to spin. By Thursday morning, Kendra had started double booking herself. I saw it first on her calendar, a standing 9 a.m. slot marked Governance Review, color-coded red with no location, just private with GW. GW, Graham Winslow, her father-in-law, our CEO. That told me 2 things. The board had questions. She didn't have the answers. She started walking into meetings 5 minutes late, hair pulled back too tight, laptop hugged to her chest like a shield. The same woman who once mocked my paranoia about logs was now asking people to circle back in Slack, soft-pedaling, censoring, watching her language like the walls could hear her. Because maybe now, they could. The funny part, I didn't say a word. Not when legal asked for historical documentation on vendor approvals. Not when the CFO requested a reconciliation timeline on the new architecture. Not even when the Jakarta vendor sent an email asking Hawes Kendra's team submitted their SLA amendments yet, and copied me instead of her. I just archived everything. There's a kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. The kind where people start asking, "Hey, did you hear what happened in that meeting?" Even though no one really knows what happened. Only that something cracked. She messaged me once that day. Just one line. "Can you confirm when that systems rollback actually ended?" I almost smiled. That rollback was her idea. A month ago, she'd bypassed ops to push it through. Now she was trying to retro-document it to rewrite a version of the story where she never touched the live environment. Too late. I responded, "Logs available upon request. Let me know who's requesting." No emoji, no tone. Just the kind of message you read twice because you're not sure what's implied. That afternoon, I passed by the executive huddle room and saw her sitting alone staring at a folder she hadn't opened. Her hand was on the cover, motionless, not flipping, just there. I knew that folder. I'd designed its tab system for audit compliance. We used those for board pre-reads. She wasn't leading the meeting. She was being prepped for it. It's strange watching someone unravel politely. No outbursts, no crying, just a slow evaporation of certainty. 100 little cracks in the glass before it finally shatters. And you wonder, do they even realize yet? There was a moment midday when she passed me in the corridor and said, "Hey, Owen," with that tight smile, the one she used on clients she didn't respect. She added, "Appreciate your help lately. Things have been moving fast." I looked her in the eye and said, "Happy to help. Speed reveals structure." She blinked, then kept walking. If you've ever had to sit quietly while someone destroyed their own future just to protect yours, like subscribe and share your story below. I'll be reading. That night I got a text from someone in finance. Random Q. Did you ever approve the spend increase Kendra cited in Q4? Asking because the documentation doesn't line up. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because the documentation always lines up. Eventually. And as I shut my laptop that night, I remembered something Kendra said during one of our first project reviews. She'd leaned over my monitor and said, "You know what wins in this industry? Confidence, not correctness." She was wrong, and very soon, she was going to learn just how wrong. Friday morning, Kendra didn't show up for the 9 a.m. sync. Not late, not rescheduled, just nothing. That's when I knew the internal escalation had gone live. By 9:06, I got a calendar hold from the Executive Office Subject Governance Audit, Infrastructure Authorization Threads. Required attendees, Legal Audit Chair, Interim CTO. Optional, Owen Merrick. Optional. It said more than if they'd called me directly. I clicked the invite and scrolled down. There it was, attached Q4 system modifications, submission variance report, yajin to tots PDF. My own audit trail, the one I kept offline. Digitally signed and time-stamped, including the authorization gap Kendra had tried to close retroactively. The gap was small, just a 72-hour window. But inside that window, her team had deployed a feature into production without formal rollback testing, and a vendor caught it, quietly sent a memo. She ignored it, and now it was all in the report. She had signed off on a compliance rollback for a feature she never had approval to launch in the first place. I knew exactly what this meeting was. It wasn't a discussion. It was preparation for the board, for Graham, for what would come after. I didn't attend. Didn't need to, because by noon, the chatter started. Not loud, just fragments. In break rooms, over Slack, in email threads with oddly vague subject lines. By 2 p.m., I got a message from Allison, one of the privacy analysts. "Hey, did Kendra really bypass rollback protocol in Q4? I stared at it for a moment, typed, "Let's talk Monday," then deleted it, rewrote. "All findings are with governance. I'll defer to their process." That's how you do it. No fireworks, no revenge monologue, just documentation, just silence with edges. I thought about something she'd said to me in the early months when we were still pretending to respect each other. We were reviewing the third-party audit queue, and she'd snapped, "You can't run a company like a courtroom, Owen." Maybe not, but you can run it like an investigation. And by late afternoon, it was clear the investigation had left the back channel. I passed by the East Conference Room and saw two people I'd never seen before, outside counsel most likely. One had a red file folder open on the table, with my name highlighted at the top of a printed email chain. She had used my name in that approval, but I had never replied. They had the metadata now, the send time, the non-response. She had sent the email after the system was live. Her insurance policy didn't exist. And this time, I wasn't going to save her from the fallout. What struck me wasn't the chaos, it was the absence of it. No angry emails, no shouting match, just procedural gravity pulling everything inwards slowly, inevitably. By 5:30 p.m., I got a text from someone in HR. "Hey Owen, are you available Monday for a follow-up about the Q4 project chain? Legal may loop you in." I sat back in my chair, eyes on the monitor, watching my inbox refresh. That text, it wasn't a request. It was positioning. They were preparing the official response, and they needed to know how much I knew, how much I'd seen, how much I could verify under oath if necessary. This wasn't about covering for Kendra anymore. It was about protecting the company from her, and all I'd done was let the documentation speak. The same documentation she once told me was a waste of my time. Back then, I remember her tossing a printed clause back on my desk and saying, "You spend too much time hedging Owen. Nobody ever got promoted by being the guy with the backup plan." She was right. I didn't get promoted. But now they needed me in the room. Because when the CEO has to watch someone testify, it's usually not the loud one who gets called first. It's the one with the receipts. And I had them all. The first headline hit at 9:12 a.m. Not from us. From a trade journalist I barely knew. Axionet faces internal audit after anonymous report reveals rollback compliance violations. I didn't even click it at first. Just watched as the Slack channels went eerily quiet, like someone had pulled the power cord from the whole floor. That's when I knew the real collapse had started. Kendra didn't show up that morning. No email, no Teams message, just gone. Her last visible action in the system was forwarding the compliance inquiry to her private inbox at 7:03 p.m. the night before, and that's when the IT hold triggered. That part wasn't even mine, that was legal's doing. I had only built the metadata engine, the tool that logged every action tied to admin permissions. But someone in InfoSec finally followed the trail I left. Someone with a badge and subpoena power. They froze her account by 9:30. I got the message from Alice and same analyst from before, short and tense Merrick, you'll want to stay off Slack today. Board convo just escalated to external legal. So I took her advice. I walked the long loop around the campus phone, off-eyes scanning the manicured hedges I used to trim when I was still a junior contractor, back when I thought playing by the rules would earn you something more than extra work and a polite nod. Back when I still thought Kendra Vale gave a damn about anything besides climbing. She once told me in front of the whole team during a Q3 kickoff, risk is just another word for control. You either take it or you become it. We all laughed. I even smiled. Now, she was on the wrong side of her own doctrine, and the risk had turned on her. By 11:00 hours, our vendors had already started pulling their service agreements. One of them, OrbiCrypt, sent an internal escalation citing chain of custody breakdown and executive repudiation risk. I didn't write those phrases, but I knew exactly what they meant. That clause I embedded in the March MOU, the one that required dual sign-off for any schema override Kendra had bypassed it. And thanks to the version tracking protocol I insisted we preserve, it was all there, time-stamped, replicated, indisputable. You'd think there'd be panic, people shouting lawyers in glass rooms. But the silence was worse. It was the silence of a company trying not to breathe the wrong way while it bled out. At 2:17, HR scheduled a special governance session. Invite only 6 people. I wasn't on it. But one of the names was Graham Vale. That's when I stopped walking. Graham was never copied on anything like this. Ever. For him to be there meant they weren't protecting her anymore. She wasn't just exposed, she was alone. I'd seen that look before on other execs, other companies when the center falls out and all the loyalty contracts evaporate. But this time, it felt heavier. She had gambled everything on appearing untouchable, but the audit didn't care about her image. The metadata didn't care about her pedigree. And the system, my system, never forgot. I still remember the afternoon she let me go. She didn't look up from her tablet when she signed the separation papers, just tapped her pen twice and said, "Nothing personal, Owen. You're just legacy." I remember the weight of that word. Legacy. Now she was the ghost. And the system she tried to replace me for was testifying in my place. By 4:00 p.m., I got a call from a restricted number. It was brief. "Mr. Merrick, we'd like to schedule a deposition related to the rollback discrepancies identified in your version tracking platform. Counsel will provide dates. You are not currently the subject of any action. We appreciate your cooperation." And then just like that, I was in. I stared at the gray clouds folding over the campus skyline, felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, not victory, just inevitability. Kendra Vale had built her rise on deletion omission and plausible deniability. But the one person she deleted was the only one who remembered everything. And tomorrow, I'd be sitting across from her husband in a room that recorded everything. The day the subpoenas landed, I was sitting on the front porch of my brother's cabin in Vermont, watching the snow swallow the last bit of road. My phone buzzed. One unread email. Subject line. Notice of compelled testimony. State of New Jersey, Axionet Corp. I didn't smile. Not really. Just leaned back in the chair and let the cold bite into my fingers. The dominoes had started to fall 2 days prior quietly at first. Axionet's vendor access logs had been flagged by a third-party audit team. No one at corporate had caught the embedded override that allowed Kendra to bypass retention protocols, because technically, I had built it. But I also built the trail that made sure it lit up the moment someone touched it. You remember the phrase from Part 3, temporary escalation control, granted under Tier 4, override logged in, exception report, 1129. Yeah, that line got entered into Axionet's risk ledger 3 weeks before I left, buried deep. But real. Once that surfaced in the compliance probe, the SEC wasn't far behind. Especially once they noticed the funding allocations linked to her husband's pet project, where the numbers didn't match the procurement invoices. Turns out ghost vendors don't do great under scrutiny, and neither does a CEO when his name's on the authorization ledger. What no one knew, not even Kendra, was that 2 weeks before I left, I sat down with a quietly terrified junior analyst from the finance team. Her name was Riley, fresh out of Rutgers. She'd flagged a series of unusual invoice cycles and had the good sense to screen record her attempts to trace the payments. They told her it was a sensitive innovation fund and to delete the log. She didn't. She emailed it to me. At the time, I didn't know if I'd use it, but when Kendra fired me just to impress the board, knowing what was already hidden inside those ledgers, I realized something. She wasn't just reckless, she was stupid in public. And stupid in public is a compliance officer's favorite gift. I watched the coverage unfold the same way everyone else did. Silent Chiron banners scrolling under photos of boardrooms and briefcases. Axionet's stock halted, then dropped 19%. Internal statement: we're cooperating fully. External memo: no comment. And in the middle of it all, Graham Vale's CEO standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who caused it all, his daughter-in-law, his company's new liability. She looked smaller on camera, or maybe it was just the absence of control. The day before my deposition, I received a call from a blocked number. I didn't answer, but the voicemail came through. It was Graham. His voice was calm but frayed. "Owen, I don't know what's left to say. You were always right about the risk posture. I just didn't see what it would cost. I saved the voicemail, not out of vindication, just so I'd remember that moment. You spend enough time as the guy behind the system, and you start to forget you have power. Kendra reminded me I wasn't invisible, I was necessary. And she made the mistake of forgetting that necessary people don't stay quiet forever. Funny thing, remember that brass key card I kept in my top drawer? The one from the first data center we ever built on site. It was long deactivated, but I kept it, a reminder of where all this started. On the morning of my testimony, I tucked it into my jacket pocket. Not because I needed it, because it reminded me that this entire empire had been physical once. Real. Tangible. Before it became a playground for people like her. And I was about to take it back. If you've ever watched someone unravel publicly, someone who thought they were untouchable and you felt nothing but calm, like subscribe and tell me your story. I'll be listening. They seated me across from the legal team in a pale room with no windows and too much fluorescent light. And just before the stenographer started, one more person entered quietly. Kendra. She didn't speak. She didn't look at me. But when she sat down, I saw her hands trembling just slightly under the table. I glanced down at the folder in front of me. Page 1, Audit Log. Excerpt, Tier 4, Override Exception. Entry 1129. Page 2, Invoice Trail, Vendor ID 847J. Flagged Payment Irregularities. Page 3, Screen Recording Transcript, logged by R. Harper. I looked up. The lawyer cleared his throat. Owen Merrick, for the record, can you confirm your role in the compliance architecture at Axionet Corp and explain in your own words what you discovered? I didn't answer right away, because for the first time in a long time, I had the floor, and I knew exactly where I wanted to begin. It came through a LinkedIn message of all things. No lawyer, no letterhead, just a plain note from Nathan Crowley, Senior Director of Ops, and someone I used to mentor. Hey, Owen, the board's been reevaluating things. There's interest in discussing a potential advisory engagement. Flexible terms. Just a chat. You interested? I stared at it for a full minute before even blinking. 3 months ago, I was escorted out like a liability. No exit interview, no handshake. Just the brittle click of Marion Bell's heels on polished tile as she told me I was being terminated for non-compliance with workflow modernization. Kendra's words parroted by HR. And now when the subpoenas had started landing and internal Slack channels were suddenly private or archived, I was getting casual outreach from one of Kendra's inner circle lieutenants. It wasn't just offensive, it was tactical. They wanted to see what I knew, how much I was going to reveal in deposition. Maybe dangle a shiny title, a soft NDA, a generous retainer to plug the leaks before they flooded the boat. But I didn't respond, not right away. Instead, I walked downstairs to the basement. Laura was out getting groceries, so it was just me, the silence, and the dusty metal file box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was the black notebook I used when I first started at Axionet. Pre-merger, before Kendra. Before the vanity rebrands and the policy rewrites and the backdoor firings. I flipped to a page marked with an old paperclip. There it was, my original compliance architecture for modular vendor onboarding, signed, time-stamped, and initialed by 4 executives, none of whom were still at the company. That framework was the same one Kendra had violated when she bypassed third-party vendor clearance to fast-track ValeSource, her father's shell logistics firm. And now, it was the reason I was being subpoenaed. Because the system I built had been ignored, overwritten, and corrupted, and because I had documented every change. I set the notebook on the table and sat with it, hands folded, like I was waiting for someone to speak first. Wouldn't it be easier just to take the offer, get a retainer, redact a few statements, smile politely on Zoom? But then I remembered the look on her face when she fired me. That smug, polished certainty. Like her cruelty was some form of leadership. Like doing it publicly in front of juniors and ops assistants made her bold, visionary. I remembered the silence in the room. No one spoke. No one even breathed. And I remembered how the next morning my daughter Sophia had asked why I was home so early. That offer wasn't a peace treaty. It was a muzzle. I typed out a response. "Hi, Nathan. I appreciate the outreach, but I've already been scheduled to appear in front of the Internal Compliance Committee, and I intend to speak fully and truthfully. No hard feelings. Just time for clarity." I clicked send, and for the first time since this started, I felt weight leave my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, just gravity easing. Before I closed my laptop, I checked the calendar invite from the outside legal firm again, pre-testimony strategy call. Friday, 10 a.m. Then I noticed a new name CC'd on the call thread. Graham Vale, CEO. They were getting nervous. Good, because I hadn't told them the full story yet. And once I did, once everything came out under oath, Kendra wouldn't be the only one who had to answer for what happened at Axionet. The first news outlet to pick it up was Westbridge Business Journal, just a quiet little story tucked beneath their Friday morning headline. But the headline, it sat under Axionet executive subpoenaed in whistleblower compliance probe. That's when it all changed. The article didn't name me, not directly, but it referenced the original protocol logs, the one I'd written 5 years earlier. The internal policy override authorization tied to my employee ID. Kendra Vale had used it as a backdoor. And now that same backdoor was being questioned by a congressional subcommittee on federal subcontractor compliance. By midweek, the Chronicle ran a follow-up. This time, it wasn't quiet. Federal inquiry expands into Axionet Corp after internal conflict of interest allegations. That phrase, internal conflict of interest, was the board's wording, not mine. They used it like bleach, hoping it would sanitize what was essentially fraud wrapped in entitlement. But the kicker? Their own legal department had released an addendum to the internal memo, a single paragraph. The originator of the override protocol is no longer employed at Axionet and was not involved in the authorization chain leading to the flag transaction. I remember reading that line 3 times. It was the first time in months I'd seen my work acknowledged, even if it was just to distance themselves from it. Still, that line was mine. Meanwhile, Kendra's calendar was cleared. No more LinkedIn posts. Her last one, 3 weeks old, was a filtered selfie from the executive lounge in D.C. The caption said, "Building legacy, one deal at a time." Now her legacy was being rebuilt without her consent. Marion Bell resigned before the audit hearing even began. Personal reasons, the internal memo read. But I knew what it meant. She'd tried to play both sides, stay close to power, and cover the risk. She ended up being the risk. And Graham Vale, he didn't resign, not yet. But for the first time in years, he looked like a man who knew how fragile his world really was. Diana Keller told me he asked for a quiet resolution behind closed doors some way to make the story disappear. But subpoenas don't respect PR firms, and the public doesn't forget silence once it's been broken. At first I thought I'd feel vindicated. I thought I'd stand taller. But mostly I just felt still. Not peace, not regret, just the strange weight of finally being heard. The irony? Most people still don't know it was me. To the outside world, I'm just a former systems analyst who quietly left the company before the storm. But inside the organization, among the people who remember that line of code that buried claws, I'm the ghost that turned the tide. I walked past Axionet's building last week. It was after hours, lights dimmed, only a few cleaning crews moving inside. For a second, I saw myself in the glass. Not the Owen Merrick who stayed silent. Not the one who got fired. The one who remembered everything. Who waited. That version of me, he wasn't smiling, but he looked whole. And maybe that's enough. The hearing room was colder than I expected. Not physically, just sterile. Polished oak table, pale, lighting a pitcher of water with no glasses. Kendra sat 3 seats down, silent. No blazer this time. Just a muted gray sweater and a face I barely recognized. I don't think she made eye contact once. They didn't need a dramatic moment, just the facts. So that's what I gave them. Policy references, date-stamped change logs. My access history. A copy of the original escalation memo to Marion Bell. The exact clause Kendra violated when she bypassed system approvals. Section 9.2.3 of the Corporate Ethics Charter, fiduciary conflict of interest during executive procurement decisions. She signed off on her own husband's bid while suppressing 2 lower bids from independent vendors. I spoke for 24 minutes, no grandstanding, just the truth. The board's final note was read into the record. In light of violations cited in Section 9.2.3 and confirmed by internal audit, Kendra Vale's resignation is accepted effective immediately. Further review of Graham Vale's fiduciary oversight will proceed pending counsel. No one clapped. That's not how these things end. But I did glance at the pen on the table, the same one she once tossed toward me like a dog fetching a stick. It sat untouched, capped a shallow scratch on its side. She didn't pick it up this time. I walked out of that room with nothing in my hands. No badge, no files, no applause. Just a strange full silence. Diana Keller offered me a quiet role 2 weeks later, compliance consulting. I said yes, not for the title, not even for the satisfaction, but because I knew how much damage silence could do. I didn't want applause, I didn't want revenge headlines, I just wanted it on record. The board minutes, the clause reference, the fact that someone showed up and told the truth. Some nights I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed silent. Would you have walked away? Or would you have shown up and told the truth, even if your voice shook? Share your own experiences. Like, subscribe for more stories. Because sometimes, the silence at the end, that was the loudest justice of all.